giving you the insider takes and the big picture view on the Dawgs. This is On the Beat, presented by Ingles with DawgNation insider Mike Griffith and Cody Chaffins.
Happy Monday night and welcome into On the Beat. I'm Cody Chaffins alongside Mike Griffith. And Mike, I see you pop up on my screen and the Johnny Cash song, I've Been Everywhere, man, comes up. You have been all over the place for the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's been busy and, glad to be back after missing last Monday night on the holiday. But, of course, the SEC spring meetings were in Destin last week, and there was a lot of conjecture and a lot of speculation, a lot of talk about what the future of college football might look like from a playoff standpoint to a scheduling standpoint. And, of course, this last weekend, the Diamond Dogs, Georgia baseball, with a disappointing end of the season. A bit of a shocker at Foley Field as Georgia was eliminated in regional play, but we can get into that seeding in that bracket a little bit later on in the show. Might have been a little bit more to it than meets the eye, Cody.
Yeah, so the Diamond Dogs are now on the beach, but we will also talk about what happened on the beach down in Destin last week and kind of with the Georgia spin, because a lot of this has been talked about, what could happen, what may happen, but one thing we will talk about is what's going to be best for Georgia, what Dog fans should want out of all of this. And you talked about the spring meetings down there, and Greg Sankey kind of had to be at some points, everybody else was painting him as the bad guy standing up there. You know, he always gets painted as the villain. But one of the things they talked about are playoff formats. And what's so interesting is we've come to learn all this new lingo, right? So we have this 5-11 or the 4-4-2-2-1 or AQs and what means what. So there's so many different things out there. And actually, the way I kind of thought the SEC was going is not necessarily the way it looks like they're leaning right now. So kind of explain all of that playoff talk that happened down in Destin last week.
Yeah, so there was a lot. So let me preface it by saying this, Cody. As we tape this show on Monday, we're still waiting for the House versus NCAA settlement, and I know most people have heard more about that than they'd care to hear. Apparently, I don't know, as I've said, maybe this judge in California is watching the redwood trees grow. We're all shocked and surprised that there hasn't been a decision made yet. And a lot of what happens, that needs to be the first domino to fall, right? So we're all kind of waiting on that. A lot of the things that would apply from that ruling would start on July 1st, so the clock's running. There's a sense of urgency among a lot of football programs that have some walk-ons and student athletes that are kind of waiting to find out if they're going to be allowed to practice with the team this fall. So waiting on that. But to your question, let's start with the playoff format, because it's going to take knowing the playoff format for the SEC to really know what the best decision is for their scheduling model. Now, there's a good chance that the SEC is going to have to determine a scheduling model for 2026, at least, before they know the playoff format. And I asked Greg Sankey, I said, so when you pick this new scheduling model, does that mean it's a 2026-27 model? Or he said, oh, we're looking at everything. So he left the window of possibility open that the SEC could come up with a scheduling model that would only apply to 2026. I thought that was interesting. And I'll add this note as well. He said that if the SEC sticks with 8 games, they do have a plan for a schedule that would protect all the league rivalries. There was a lot of thought that in order to keep all the rivalries going, that you would need to go to a 9-game schedule. Well, Sankey said that's not necessarily the case. So the SEC is considering an 8 or a 9-game league schedule, and we'll get into what Kirby Smart said about that a little bit later in the program. The different playoff models, the two that were primarily discussed, for an expanded 16-team playoff, which looks like that's the direction it's going after this season. This is going to be the last year of the 12-team playoff. Looks like we'll be moving to 16 teams. So the first one was something called the automatic qualifier model. And under this model, the SEC and Big Ten would get 4 teams each. And then the ACC and the Big 12 would get 2 teams each. You'd take the highest group of 5 ranked team, the Boise States of the world. And then you would take 3 at-large teams. And that's how you'd come up with your 16-game field. Now, the 5-11 model is a bit simpler. And that is just taking the 4 power conference champions, SEC, Big 10, Big 12, ACC, and the highest group of 5 champion, and then the next 11 best teams. But here's the hitch, Cody. The Big Ten says that, well, they don't want to do a 5-11 unless the SEC plays a 9-game league schedule like they do. And the SEC says, look, you're not going to tell us what to do. So we got a bit of a hang up here. The issue with the automatic qualifier is that you've got the ACC and the Big 12 chirping saying, well, that may not be in the best interest of college football. What if, per se, all of a sudden the ACC or the Big 12 gets really, really good and they're stuck in this format where they only get 2 automatic qualifiers? Well, that's kind of a straw man argument because the SEC and the Big 10 have all the money. And it's not to say that it couldn't happen, but it's not very likely that all of a sudden the Big 12 and the ACC would be getting that many teams in the top 16. Now, one final point of data before I toss back to you. Greg Sankey felt so strong about the SEC schedule strength that they did a deep dive and they distributed some material at the SEC spring meetings that reflected that over the last 11 years, and that time frame was chosen because that's how long we had it goes back to the start of the 4-game playoffs, the expanded playoffs. Both the SEC and the Big Ten have averaged more than 5 teams each ranked in the top 16. So if you're going with an automatic qualifier model that has 4 each, theoretically you could say 5 each, but they're not pushing for that. They're just saying 4 each based on those results over the last 11 years, where both of those conferences have averaged more than 5 teams in the top 16 and also more than 5 teams in the top 14. So there is a recent trend, track record, data, whatever you want to say, that suggests this automatic qualifier model is more than fair. But if there's going to be people that grouse about it, and there are, then the SEC says, well, let's just go 5-11 and let's just sort it out. And you know what? Maybe you'll get 6, maybe you'll get 7 SEC teams. Maybe you'll get 3 or 4, depending on who's on the college football playoff committee, Cody.
Yeah, it's so interesting because when it first came out, the 4-4-2-2-1, the automatic qualifiers, of course the ACC and the Big 12 are going to be mad about it because they're not getting as many. But here's the thing, they also signed an agreement allowing the Big 10 and SEC to kind of lead the way moving forward with the college football playoff. But yeah, at first it seemed like, the SEC will want their automatic teams in, especially after last year when teams got left out. But it actually, the reporting is, and the way it sounds like it came out of Destin, is actually the coaches want the 5-11 model because they, don't want to have to play a 9th SEC game, especially if it's one of these crossover games. It didn't sound like that went over real well with some of the coaches down there in Destin. And the other part is, they don't want to limit themselves to just those 4 and then maybe some at-large teams because you could actually get fewer teams in than would normally. I think last year the SEC would have gotten 6 teams in the tournament if things would have gone the way they are now.
Yeah, that's right. And one more note on the automatic qualifier model. The discussion then goes to, well, if there are 4 automatic qualifiers, how do you decide who they are? And what happens to the conference championship game? Well, Greg Sankey said there's a strong movement from the coaches. They want to keep that game. Obviously, Georgia's played in it 7 of the last 8 years. So the model that I saw kicked around the most for determining 4 automatic qualifiers would be the top 2 teams continue to play in the SEC championship game, and they're automatically in. They're going to be the number 1 and number 2 seed based on the result of that game. But then to determine 3 and 4, you have those play-in games. Now, this adds some volume to the television set, which makes more money. So there's some attraction to the model because it's going to enable these leagues to make more money as they add playoff games within the structure of the 4 automatic qualifiers. So you'd have the top 2 in the SEC playing a league championship game, and then you'd have the number 3 seed play the number 6 seed, and the number 4 team play the 5 seed. This would be on the higher ranked teams' campuses. Now, Steve Sarkisian in Texas brought up a good point. He said, what if I finish in 3rd place in the SEC, but I lose the playing game? You're going to tell me that I'm not one of the 16 best teams in the country? So there's a rub with all of these plans. There's a pro and a con. And, I thought Kirby Smart, talking about this, Kirby's kind of been on both sides of the coin for an 8 or a 9-game season, Cody, but he brought up Georgia's non-conference scheduling. and said, was Georgia better off playing Clemson last year or a ninth conference game? And he made the case that it was better to play Clemson because it showed the SEC strength early on.
Yeah, playing a Missouri, say, in that spot wouldn't have done much for Georgia and the SEC, kind of proving themselves. Hey, this is your conference champion, ACC, and we beat them pretty handily early on in the season. And the thing I don't like about the crossover games at the end is because, yes, there would be a chance if you lost that game that you could still get an at-large bid. But we've seen how this committee has really treated losers of games, right? They don't like the loss column, and especially late in the season. So you'd have a team like last year, it would have been probably Alabama, Ole Miss playing a game, and Tennessee and South Carolina. The loser of those games, and a 5-11, those teams would probably have been in. But if you lose that game, then you're trying to make the argument for an at-large bid, and it doesn't sound like that's going to happen. And then the other reason I think, and Greg Sankey hasn't actually said out loud which one he prefers, the 5-11 or the 4-4-2-2-2-1. But I think it's pretty obvious the way he came out with all of the handouts at the last day of the meetings that they were making the argument about strength of schedule and how it was not really looked at favorably, or the way that the College Football Playoff Committee said they were going to really look at it. So he brought out the receipts and said, here, we are really playing a stronger schedule than anybody else, and here's how we can prove it. And for that reason, it sounded like he's leaning more of that 5-11 model, just because that would be more at-large teams that you would have to fight for. And I think he's making a good argument, and that argument, I think, will be taken, and the College Football Playoff Committee moving forward will change the way they said it. A little lip service this year, we're considering strength of schedule. Well, I think it really might change moving forward, and that's something Sankey was already laying the groundwork for in Destin.
Yeah, that was actually the directive from Rich Clark, the executive director of the College Football Playoff, when he did a press conference, a teleconference that I was a part of before the first CFP rankings came out. He said the strength of schedule metric would be the most weighted because it was the one metric that traveled across all the conferences. If you look at run defense or pass offense, it's relative to who you're playing. Obviously, it's not apples to apples when you compare an SEC schedule to an ACC schedule. And more data on that, when you looked at the College Football Index from ESPN last year, there were 13 SEC teams that ranked in the top 25 of schedule strength. Georgia was number one. There were 9 Big Ten teams ranked in the top 25 of schedule strength. There was only 2 ACC teams, and then the other one was Notre Dame. No Big 12 teams. So when we talk about schedule strength, it's important to note that all things are not created equally. And Greg Sankey gave another really good example, Cody, that I think helps people maybe see it a little bit more clearly. And this was an example he said that was actually used in front of the committee last year. It's hard to ignore, hard to believe they really ignored this. But he pointed out that if you were to play the number 1 and number 130 team in the nation, your schedule strength would be 65.5, right? You had 130 and 131 divided by 2. If you were to play the number 65 and the number 66 team, your schedule strength would be 65.5. But we can all sit here and agree that you'd be much better off playing the number 65 and 66 team than you would playing the number 1 or number 130 team. Well, the problem, and when it comes to the rankings for the SEC, they've only really had 2 teams outside the top 60. And so they don't have the volume of bottom dwellers like other conferences do. So it's much more difficult to navigate an SEC schedule and stay out of that loss column. And unfortunately for the SEC last year's committee, chaired by Ward Manuel of the University of Michigan, stressed the loss column and the win column more than the schedule strength. When we look at Indiana, who did Indiana beat during the regular season of relevance? When we look at SMU, who did they play at the top of the ACC? And yet Indiana was ranked favorably in those rankings, as was SMU, which actually got in after losing their conference game. Now, we can step back and say, now, do we really believe SMU would have beaten Alabama, Ole Miss, or South Carolina at the end of the I wouldn't have believed that. But when I asked Ward Manuel that question on one of those teleconferences that I did each week after the rankings came out, his response was, well, teams can't control their schedules. That's not supposed to be part of the discussion. The discussion was supposed to center on schedule strength. And so I kind of felt like last year, and I don't think I'm the only one that felt this way, that the schedule strength was not properly added into that equation. And even Kirby Smart stood up there and said that last week, Cody. He said, I got a problem when you're saying that teams like Alabama, Ole Miss, and South Carolina aren't among the best teams in the country. And Kirby was speaking on behalf of the league. He made that point as well. Look, that was not a self-serving Kirby Smart down there in Destin. That was a Kirby Smart looking out for what was best in college football and being willing and able to take a stand, Cody. I don't know, were you surprised that Kirby was as strong, came out as strong as he did about the transfer portal? It's not like Kirby was ready to write the rule right then and there.
Yeah, we're going to get to more of that. But yeah, Kirby came in with some definite things he wanted to get out on the table. You talked about the transfer portal. He also had his opinions on, wasn't afraid to call out, hey, South Carolina and Alabama and Ole Miss should have been in the playoff last year. He wasn't afraid he didn't shy away from any of that. There was no political answers out there from Kirby Smart. He was very direct on what he wanted, which I like to see.
Yeah, and what he needs to do because Mark Stoops has been at Kentucky a little bit longer, but he didn't see much of Mark Stoops down there. I get the feeling Mark Stoops in Kentucky are maybe one season away from going in different directions. But Kirby is that guy in the room. Lane Kiffin talked about it last year that Kirby's kind of the guy in the room now that Nick Saban wasn't there, and that was surprising not to see Nick pop up in some form or fashion with his duties with ESPN and the fine job that he did last year. But yeah, it was kind of the Kirby Smart show. And when we do talk about the portal, it'll be interesting, to hear how Greg Sankey pretty much backed him up. And I kind of felt like Lane Kiffin was backing him up. They asked Lane Kiffin about the playoff model, and Lane just shrugged and said, I just want to see the best teams in the playoff. And it doesn't sound like such a strange notion to think that the best teams
It's not
should be,
radical, no.
but we're in this age, and you've heard it, Cody, over your years, just like I have, that sports can become a microcosm of society. I call it the AYSO Participation Award mentality. And right now it's like, well, we got to have representation. We got to have fair represent. No, you really don't. I mean, sports is not supposed to be well, let's make sure everybody's fairly represented here in the play. It's supposed to be the best. But I think you have three factions here. I think you have three masters that you're trying to serve, so to speak, right? So one is you want the best teams in the playoff. That seems like the most obvious in the purest form. Two is the equal representation, making sure all the conferences have an equal opportunity. You saw that forced fed a little bit last year with four conference champions getting a bye, even though I don't think Arizona State or Boise State were in the top four in the nation. They each got that bye like they were. Fair representation. And then the third is what makes the most money. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, ESPN, ABC, NBC, Fox, these television giants, they have to pay the bills and they dole out tens of millions of dollars to the schools in the respective conferences that the schools in the respective conferences are saying, yeah, feed me. I got to come up with this money to pay these players and still try to keep all these other non-revenue sports afloat. And oh, by the way, there's that $2.8 billion settlement. Once House versus NCAA gets ruled on, there's going to be $2.8 billion worth of back pay to student athletes over the past 10 years for the past usage of their name, image, and likeness. So it's a money game. Now, can you find a way to have the best teams, equal representation, and money? I think that's the target that everyone's trying to hit right now.
One thing I want to know, Mike, from you, as we talked about the SEC schedule could go to 8 or 9 games. We talk about the different playoff models. What's best for Georgia? What should Georgia want? We talked about Kirby's throwing his weight around to try and get what the Dogs want. But in your opinion, what will be the best thing for Georgia, playoff model-wise, an 8 or 9 SEC game schedule?
I think the 5-11 would be best for Georgia. And I think that the reason I like the 5-11 is I don't want to see it go to a 9-game SEC schedule. I don't think that's a good thing. I think I like seeing Georgia play good non-conference competition. I know Louisville, there's a trip to Louisville coming up on the schedule. There's games with Ohio State and Clemson and Florida State in the future. And because the Dogs also play Georgia Tech at the end of every year, which, conversation for another day. But all of a sudden, now Georgia Tech's got teeth. I mean, Brent Key has done a good job making that program more competitive. That's a formidable opponent. Don't get amnesia. That 8 overtime game really did happen. Georgia was 1 foot away from losing at home to Georgia Tech. So when you keep in mind the schedule strength that Georgia has, I like seeing the non-conference games. I thought those Georgia Clemson games were really interesting and fun to go to and watch and telling. I thought the Georgia Oregon game certainly was exciting and in the right way for the Dogs to start out a perfect 2022 season. I like seeing teams play teams out of conference. And I think last year was proof positive that even with an 8 game schedule, the league can still beat itself up pretty good. You take a look at Georgia, and they won the SEC championship game, but they did it running on fumes. Ernest Green was hurt. Tate Ratledge came back from surgery. I don't think he was 100%. Carson Beck, the starting quarterback, was knocked out at halftime. There were times, many games last year, where Georgia was down to one scholarship running back because of injuries at that position. At the start of the year, the defensive line rotation was very thin. It wasn't until later in the year when the defensive line started to beef up a little bit. So I think the wear and tear, and to use a term that Kirby Smart put out there, the mental bandwidth of playing the type of games that take place in the SEC on the road, under the lights, in those hostile environments, I think that can really wear you down. And I think that contributed significantly to how the SEC teams fared, most specifically Georgia, to how they fared in the playoff and why we haven't seen an SEC team win a national title since the Bulldogs did it in 2022.
Totally agree. I love the 5-11 playoff model. I also would love to see the 8-game SEC schedule stay there just so we can keep college football interesting and keep some of those conference crossover games alive. Good stuff, Mike. All right, so we talked about SEC scheduling and the playoff expansion, but Kirby Smart says that's actually not the most important thing on the table right now. What is that? We will talk about that coming back. Still going to talk some Diamond Dogs as well. This is On the Beat, presented by Ingles.
It's time to discover the convenience and time savings of contact-free pickup with Ingles Curbside. Just visit shop.ingles-markets.com or download the app. And your Ingles personal shopper gets to work with specialized training on how to select the freshest items for a pre-scheduled pickup. They'll even text you with updates. You pull up to a designated space and your personal shopper delivers your items right to your vehicle. Fresh, fast, and affordable. It's all in the bag. Ingles. Low prices. Love the savings.
Love having Ingles be a part of On the Beat each and every week right here on your DawgNation video channels. Now, we talked about the SEC scheduling and the college football playoff expansion and the models we could see there, but Kirby Smart stepped up to the microphone in Destin last week and said, none of that is the most important thing. He said the most important topic going on that everybody needs to get their head around is the transfer portal. How many portal openings will we have, and when will they happen? Mike, you were down there and you asked the question, and Kirby Smart said, thank you so much for asking this question, by the way. He wanted to talk about it. He feels like it's so important. And the way Kirby sees it, he wants one portal window happening in January.
Yeah, and this is an area that college football needs to get it together. I mean, people are starting to accept that there's going to be free agency now. There's going to be player movement. And, we understand how the NIL influences kids in recruiting and also through the portal. But you don't want to see teams getting influenced more than once or having someone take a wrecking ball to it, after spring drills. And Kirby made the point that with the NIL contracts now, you could feasibly pay a guy NIL money, and then January, February, March happens and other teams start tampering and they want that guy to transfer. And they take your guy after the spring after you've already paid him some NIL money. And now you've got holes in the spring that you can't fill. I mean, take a look at what happened with Tennessee and Nico, I'm going to leave you. I mean, when Nico and Tennessee split, there weren't many quarterbacks left in the portal. Everybody was kind of like, now what do we do? All the teams with quarterback issues had solved those in December for the most part, right? So here was Kirby's idea and how he explained it. right now you've got this December, January period where just all heck is breaking loose. You've got your early signing class, which by and large, most of your major signees and the majority of your class comes in December. You've got the transfer portal going on, and then you've got to figure out which one of your guys are going to stay or go to the NFL. And oh, by the way, you're still playing football. So it's been kind of a hodgepodge and a mess. And this is what Kirby said. He said, here's what you do. You got December to take care of that early signing class. Then you figure out which guys are going to the NFL and which are coming back. And then in January, early January, you open up this window. Now, Greg Sankey followed up the next day and said, all right, these are the dates. The day after the January 1st bowl game, and it goes 10 days. It's plenty of time to get it done. Kids still have time to enroll in school because, oh, by the way, they're still students and there are going to be spring semesters starting. So a 10-day window in January and only one portal window, not two. Now, Kirby said, hey, there's people that are out there pushing for there to be two portal windows. And he took down the arguments for it. He said, yeah, I'll be the first to admit, it's hard when you're playing football to be dealing with the transfer portal, but George has done it. He said, now, when I said it was hard, everybody said there's no crying from the yacht. And everybody kind of laughed. But hey, he did it. They've managed it. It's just going to have to be a necessary evil moving forward. And then I think he made the big point about the people that would be tampering with players if they stuck around. The final point had to do with the financial budget that the fiscal year that goes from spring to spring. And Kirby says, well, why not just change it? Otherwise it's an accounting issue. You can figure that out. Don't, let the cart pull the horse, so to speak. So I thought he did a really good job with his presentation and explaining. And these were things that he learned from the AFCA coaches meeting in Charlotte earlier this year. It's not just Kirby dreaming all this up. And you can imagine Kirby was probably pretty active talking to coaches at this AFCA coaches meeting and kind of talking to people in the room about how to do this best. So I agree with Kirby. The reason that it was the most important thing is because it's the one thing that you could get everybody on the same page with before they left Destin was this portal window. Greg Sankey's all in behind it. It's hard to imagine this not going through. One portal window gives a team an opportunity to start building through January, February, March workouts, and then into the spring. You know who's on your team. And that's important because we're also talking about the potential for roster reductions as a result of House versus NCAA. So if you're a coach, and Mike Elko, the Texas A&M coach, gave this example, if I lose my third string snapper, where am I going to get another one? It's not the NFL, Cody. You can't go to a free agent wire or trade for one.
Right.
You kind of got what you got in college sports.
And I love the idea that Kirby Smart says, I want to know what my team is so we can practice. And I feel like that helps the fans as well, because fans have gotten so jaded about, I'll believe it when he's actually on the field, and he's gonna leave anyway. What does it matter? If you can lock in your team from January to the next January, like how much better is that for fans to be able to say, I know who the Dogs are gonna be. I got spring to see them play. Get to know my team a little bit. And even in spring, I can invest in some guys because they're not going to leave the day after the G-Day game and go somewhere else. I feel like that's something. And that's another part of it, right, is that if you were going to have this April window, a lot of coaches wouldn't want to practice with their team until after that. And then we're looking at these June OTAs, which is another really hot topic that Kirby made sure to shoot down when he was at the microphone.
That's right. Kirby says, hey, we're busy in June, man. You got football camps that are going on. I think OTAs have some merit, but maybe in May. And the way they have merit is maybe you do maybe 5 or 6 of them, not a lot. So in addition to the 15 spring practices that you already get and the annual scrimmages in the G-Day game, for example, and I think that's safe for now. I think that's as much as it's a tradition. I think there's a value to it. The OTAs would give you an opportunity to work some of those younger players that are just coming into the system, or maybe even some of the guys that aren't able to show up until a little bit later in the spring because they graduate high school later. That's been the examples I've used. I think Nate Frazier, some of the kids from California,
Right.
I think they have a little bit later graduation date and a little bit harder for them to finish earlier in those California high schools. So I like the OTA idea. Cody, if you're noticing a trend here, It's that college sports is starting to look a lot more like the NFL with the free agency and the OTAs and the way players are being paid. And so if you're going to follow that model, then it just makes sense to take a deeper look into the things that the NFL does really well that you could put into the college game to make it more effective, more successful, and help these teams and players develop in a better way.
So, Mike, I kind of want to wrap all of this up by just asking you this because you've been to these SEC spring meetings. That's something I've never been to, so I'm curious about it because I've been to SEC media days, and that kind of has its own vibe. What is the vibe down there in Destin? Is it more laid back? And like we heard from Greg Sankey like every day, which is so interesting, and he's not afraid to answer anybody's question. He literally stood up there till people ran out of questions on the last day. So what's the vibe down there like? And, we like to think of Kirby Smart as this elder statesman. Does he carry that weight when he's around all these other guys?
He really does. And it's different. I don't know that I would say it's more laid back, not from a reporter standpoint.
Okay.
You've basically got between 25 and 30 reporters. It's kind of one of those invitation kind of deals, whereas media days is like, wow, 800 or 900 people in a room and coaches on a big stage. This is a small theater with maybe 40 or 50 seats in it. I think DawgNation was taping along with some Birmingham television station. Other than that, there was a few people holding up cameras here and there. It's more intimate. You're up close. You're personal. You can get in the hallway and see these guys. I had a chance to talk to Billy Napier off to the side. Of course, last year I visited with John Calipari. Saw Josh Brooks down there, President Moorhead. You get an opportunity to bump into these people and have some one-on-one time with them. Not a lot of time, but enough if you have a question or you want to make a point or share a thought. So it's different in that sense. But right now, Cody, with all the issues going on, there was a sense of urgency. We're waiting to hear what these coaches have to say, and we're listening for answers, and we're hoping that they've got some thoughts. And you meeting in the athletic directors in the hallway, Scott Strickland or from Florida, or Greg Byrne from Alabama. What are they saying in their huddles? Or Trev Alberts from Texas A&M, who's also on this installation committee that's been formed with athletic directors from around the country, that once House versus NCAA gets settled, there's a committee in place to make sure the rules are followed. And also, this would be the committee that would vote up or vote down the one transfer portal window that Kirby Smart and Greg Sankey spoke about. So you're trying to cover all your bases. Right now, the earth is quaking beneath our feet. The college football landscape continues to shift. And for me, it was somewhat intense because I'm trying to write all this material and try to make it make sense. And it's kind of like, speed reading a 600-page book for a book report that's due that night. I mean, you're trying to be as comprehensive as possible and yet explain things in this very clear way where the average fan can digest this. I mean, some fans just kind of say, let me know when the season's going to start. But obviously, the fans that follow the University of Georgia do so very intently, as this is a championship program. And as you've pointed out with some of your questions, these decisions will shape the future for Georgia and will affect how the Bulldogs are able to compete for future college football championships. I thought it very interesting. Steve Sarkisian got up there. First of all, he debunked the reports that they spent 35 to 40 million. He said it wasn't quite that much. Maybe not quite that, maybe 34.
Right.
So he kind of debunked that. And his notion was, well, I don't know that you'll ever see another undefeated team in college football. But then Kirby Smart says, well, who knows? Maybe you'll have a bunch of haves and have-nots if there's no equity and no balance. In other words, Texas, the team with all the money is going, oh, yeah, there's never going to be. And Kirby's going, oh, yeah, you could have a team buy a championship. So Sark and Kirby kind of on two ends of the spectrum there, and kind of easy to understand why.
Yeah, it's crazy because I feel like some like 10 years ago, if we went to the SEC meetings, like the shape of college football wasn't changing. They were like deciding where the women's basketball tournament's going to be the next year. But I do feel like right now, the entire world, and as we look at the calendars, June 2nd, July 1st, we're supposed to have a bunch of new rules that we don't even know the rules yet.
Well, and I'll reflect a little bit more on Kirby and Sark. I mean, remember just was it a couple years ago, Cody, that Saban and Jimbo Fisher were all up in arms because Saban was calling out how Texas A&M had bought this recruiting class, and Jimbo was firing back, and I know all about that guy, kind of saying he knew that Nick Saban had broken rules at some point. And there was this, heated controversy between the two of them going into the spring meetings. Sark and Kirby did it in a much more polite way. And Kirby saying teams are buying championships, and Sark saying, "Oh, there'll never be another undefeated champ." It was a very lightened version of the Nick Saban Jimbo Fisher conversation from kind of saying the same thing, but not nearly as pointed, as these coaches obviously have a lot of respect for one another. And that's another thing that's changed. I kind of feel like with what's happening in college sports right now, it's almost like the SEC's having to band together because the Big Ten's got their models and the things that they want to do. And now the SEC coaches are kind of having to try to get on the same page. They really can't afford to have much of a split between them or they're not going to get anywhere. It needs to be more of a unified front. So it feels like these coaches are working more together now than ever before because of what we could only call a crisis with the NIL and the portal in conjunction changing the game right before our eyes.
Yeah, I do like this rivalry with Texas, though. That's kind of building throughout, and it's only going to add more layers this year as Texas comes to Athens for the first time in their history. Can't wait for that. All right, so one thing that Georgia and Texas both have in common as we move on is both teams were national seeds in the college baseball NCAA tournament, and both are finished for the season after not even making it to their regional finals. So really kind of heartbreaking to see Georgia go down that way as they lost to Duke on Saturday and then came back, and I thought they were going to get through Oklahoma State. They were on the brink of getting through and playing Duke one more time, but they couldn't quite do it as Oklahoma State walked them off with 4 runs in the bottom of the 9th. Mike, you were there. How shocking to you was this result for Georgia?
It happened so fast. It really did. And who would have thought that the Georgia softball team that was 7-16 in the SEC would go further in the NCAA tournament, making it to that super regional at Florida, than a Georgia baseball team that went 18-12 and had the number 2 RPI ranking in the nation, Cody. So let's start there with that seeding. Now, when this seeding came out, when Georgia was seeded 7th and they had the number 2 RPI, we thought, well, that's interesting. But you know what? As long as they're in the top 8, they get to host the regionals and super regionals. And all they got to do is take care of business at home where they're 30-4. I don't want to say it was a sure thing, but I wasn't making any plans the week of the College World Series. I thought I might be headed out to Omaha. But when that seed dropped, and then all of a sudden you saw the bracket, you said, well, that's interesting. You have Duke and Oklahoma State, 2 teams from power conferences. And then you start reading the fine print a little bit. You go, wow, Duke sure does have a lot of left-handed pitching. Not a lot of programs have as much left-handed pitching as Duke. And what was Georgia's Achilles heel? Hitting left-handed pitching. It was almost like someone stuck Duke in that bracket. And then you looked at Oklahoma State and you said, wow, they got a left-handed pitcher that's 6'5", 10-1 with a 2.77 ERA. Wow, that's a coincidence. Well, was it? I looked at the baseball committee that selected the regionals and did the rankings. And I found Florida Athletic Director Scott Strickland on this committee, as well as the Florida State Athletic Director. And then I thought a little deeper and I go, those are 2 of the schools that really recruit against Georgia in this region, aren't they? And I started to think back to the SEC spring meetings a week ago. And Scott Strickland, who was on that 2018 college football playoff committee that left Georgia out, said he wasn't sure athletic directors should be on these committees to decide it. And I'm saying, well, now, if that's not a smoking gun, I don't know what is. And I'm not saying that Scott Strickland did anything unethical, because this guy is a salt of the earth good guy. He really is. This is a very good person, a very high quality, high character person. But if someone who served on these committees is telling you that this may not be the best plan, I think that carries a lot of weight. Now, I'm not going to tell you that, Georgia could have easily gone had they been in another regional with different teams, but I do think baseball is a game of matchups, and that Duke matchup did not go well for Georgia. Now, Georgia hitters struggled with runners on base against Duke. They were 1 of 8 with players in scoring position. 5 of those guys struck out. And then against Oklahoma State in the top of the 9th with a 2-run lead, the Dogs had runners on 2nd and 3rd and no outs, didn't get anybody in, 3 strikeouts. They had their opportunities, but those teams they were playing were awful good. Duke, by the way, ended up winning this regional. They'll play the winner of the Oxford, Mississippi regional. Ole Miss plays against Murray State in that. I think that game is ongoing right now. You take a look around, you mentioned this, Cody. The SEC had three teams ranked in the top five of the RPI that were eliminated, including number one Vanderbilt. And the relevance there is Vanderbilt becomes the first number one overall seed of a tournament to not even make the regional final in Nashville. So Vandy's out. I think back to Wes Johnson telling us, hey, those deep SEC baseball tournament runs, they can cost you. Guess who won the SEC baseball tournament? Vanderbilt. But Vanderbilt gets knocked out. Texas, of all teams, Texas gets knocked out at home by UTSA, University of Texas. San Antonio takes down the Longhorns. So you had three of the top five RPI teams that are already out. Alabama, gone. The first team out. Alabama, by the way, a number 12 RPI, but not among the top 16 seeds. Adding insult to injury, they get knocked out by Southern Miss, which was the 16th seed that wasn't in the top 16 of the RPI. So Bama gets sent home early. Florida gets knocked out of their regional. Got some good baseball teams already on the sidelines, Cody.
Yeah, and there, as you said, games going on tonight, so there could be more SEC teams on the outside looking in. Super regional weekend. Now, you were there. We obviously got to hear from Wes Johnson after the loss. Let's take a quick listen to that soundbite, and then I'll let you react to what he had to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hammer on all the positives. I mean, we replaced 100. We lost 100 home runs on this team. We had 145. Fielded the ball better. Stole more bases. It broke the strikeout record. Lowered our ERA. Won 18 games in league play. 143. Obviously we were a national seed. We didn't get it done, but you got to draw back on that. You don't know what the plan is and how far you're ever going to get in this game. It's baseball. It's really hard. We've told people for years, winning is really, really hard. And we didn't get it today, but there's so many positives to build over this team.
So I'm curious to know how you feel. I think back to Scott Strickland. The end of his reign, you had a very similar situation where you're a national seed, you can't get out of the regional. Wes Johnson, right at the end of the season, gets extended through 2031. Does this change your outlook for Georgia baseball moving forward based on what happened this weekend?
No, not really, not at all. I thought it was a great season. It was a wonderfully entertaining team. You saw Slade Alford there, probably one of my favorite players to watch. Quite a showman and a very good baseball player as well. He had a huge day, 2 home runs, and so many of these guys left it on the field. And I know that when you lose a game like that, or you get eliminated, or you get upset, a lot of the fans are frustrated, shocked. Some of them are, hey, these guys need to button up their shirts, or, don't flip the bat at the other. You don't know what was coming out of that dugout, by the way. There were some pretty harsh words from those other teams directed at the Georgia players. Umpires settled that down and got some order. But, a lot of criticism in hindsight. And again, I think, talking about those matchups and Duke just having to have all those left-handed arms, and Oklahoma State having that big lefty, and what a power show they put on. They had 15 home runs through 3 games at Foley Field. Team gets hot like that from a power conference. They're not playing Stetson, like Auburn was, and not Stetson Bennett. There's a university called Stetson out there. Right? Yeah, the Hatters. Okay, yeah, I think you'd rather play them than Oklahoma State or Duke. But I digress. I thought it was a fantastic season. It was a fun season. Foley Field was a beautiful place to watch a ball game. I know a lot of Georgia fans are disappointed. As far as Wes Johnson goes, he's a great coach. He's going to do it with metrics. He's going to look at the numbers. This is how he's done what he's done in 2 years. Slade Alford, that player next to him, said, look, there's nobody that knows more about baseball than this guy. If you want to play pro baseball, there's no better place to come than the University of Georgia and play for a guy like Wes Johnson. But it's going to take some time to get some momentum, to get that pitching staff built up. They need some guys that can go a little bit deeper right now in college baseball, Cody. You have a guy throw 78 pitches or 4 or 5 innings, and, that's a day's work. I mean, it used to be, 7, 8 innings or complete games. I mean, I don't even know the last time I've seen a college pitcher throw a complete game, but Pitchers are managed differently. And now again, we have, roster restrictions coming through House versus NCAA. Could be a little bit tougher. We're going to see how Georgia does in the portal. I know Wes says he feels really good about some of the incoming freshmen that he has. You want to grow a base of players and a culture within, and then you kind of want to get those free agents on the outside. That's the model to win championships now. So you're playing with grown men instead of a lot of young men. I saw that Georgia basketball was one of the youngest teams, and yet they still made the NCAA. Had a chance to catch up with Mike White down there, Destin, by the way. But Georgia baseball expectations are going to be there. This was one of the best teams in the country all season long. Last year, they came within one game of the College World Series. You remember that North Carolina State Monday night play-in game, essentially. It was under the lights on national television. So this is a program that is now among the best in college baseball. That's not going to change. You've had $45 million worth of facilities upgrades, not just at the stadium, but in terms of the locker room and some of the more technical aspects that they need, the batting cages, the pitcher's eye, so Wes can be in there studying these opposing teams, and the players can have some premier facilities around them to train them with the most elite opportunities.
Yeah, really. I do feel like the way this program is trending and the way that Wes Johnson hasn't played, reloaded last year, right? He talked about all the home runs lost. He was able to bring in guys through the transfer portal. Expect him to do that again coming up this year. Really fun stuff. NCAA basketball, you talked about it, by the way. We talked with Mike White. There's so much talk now about expansion in that tournament as well. That could be really interesting. And we'll be able to talk more about that moving forward. But 72 or 75 teams in the tournament?
Well, I'm just glad Georgia made it when there were 68, so nobody can say, "Oh yeah, they needed the field to be expanded." And speaking of committees, we're still looking to find out who decided Gonzaga was a number 8 seed. I mean, that was not exactly the best hand dealt for Georgia basketball, but Mike was engaging down there. He spent some time with us, and boy, he really likes this St. Mary's point guard they brought in, and they got a shooter from BYU that they're excited about. So he likes what they have coming back. He says this Georgia basketball team is going to play more on the open floor, should run the floor a lot better. Now you got to replace Asa Newell, probably a first-round pick. Of course, we had him on our DawgNation videos. You can check that on our YouTube video channel. We've got that first video with Asa from last summer. When he was a signee, kind of fun looking back and seeing how a future first-round NBA pick was talking about his freshman year coming in at Georgia. Got to replace a little bit of that size, but you're going to have better shooters, and I think you're going to see that assist turnover ratio improve greatly with a lot of guys that can handle the ball, a lot of experienced players. It's a good mix of players, not as young a team, more of a veteran team. So Mike White, very confident. And Georgia right now, Cody wrote this story last week on DawgNation. Georgia already penciled in to the bracket for next year by Joe Lunardi, Mr. Bracketologist. So you could see back-to-back Georgia basketball NCAA tournament runs.
And how about that? We are talking Georgia basketball in May or June, I guess now. Really good stuff. And that goes to show you how everywhere you have been over the last 2 weeks, you're covering all the bases here on the beat. Usually it's me with boots on the ground. I got you out here shooting video now, Mike. This is great.
Yeah, that was for you, Cody. I had that tripod going there, and there was one video, and I don't think I ended up posting it. It was Sankey's third day, and he didn't say anything consequential. But about halfway through it, the tripod tipped back and fell on me and kind of went to the ceiling. And I thought, if somebody pours through this, they're going to wonder if I passed out while I was filming this. But it never did get posted, so that I was going to call you and have you cut. Never got posted. Sankey was a little curt that day. So Greg Sankey day 3 and day 4 didn't get posted. But the first 2 days of Greg Sankey did. And, if you're looking for more information, or if you kind of want to hear it for yourself, we do have video up on our YouTube channel of Greg Sankey down there 2 days, Kirby Smart, Lane Kiffin, and Mike White. And, they went into a lot of detail about a lot of things, and we've written about a lot of it at DawgNation.com, but you might find some pretty interesting kernels of information if you check out the DawgNation YouTube channel.
Yeah, the Kirby Smart and the first Greg Sankey were really, really interesting. I've watched those now a couple of times just because, like we said, they're so open and honest about everything that they're talking about. And I don't know if it's this time of year or what, but it's a lot of really good stuff that you hear from both of those guys on like the shape of college football. We'd like to talk about your 30,000-foot view. It really is like the big picture that those guys are talking about right now in a couple of, what is it, probably 6-7 weeks now, we'll be at SEC media days, and they'll be talking about the minutia of the backup linemen, and we'll get into all that. But a lot of the big picture stuff handled this week. So yeah, we are closing in on the summer. We got to get a little bit of a break here, and then we will get into SEC media days. But Mike will have all that for you, and whenever this house settlement, whenever this thing happens, Mike will have it for you on DawgNation.com and what it all means and what it all means for Georgia. Thank you so much for joining us this week. We'll see you right back here next Monday night on The Beat.